The summer of 2003 had a particular cruelty to it in the hills of Tennessee. Not the violent kind, but the slow, suffocating kind, the sort that presses down on you like a wet blanket and refuses to lift even after dark. Cicadas screamed from the tree line from sunrise to well past midnight, and the pine sap ran thick and sweet in the heat, coating everything with a smell so strong it almost felt like a presence of its own. It was in the final days of July when four cousins drove out toward the ridge together for what was supposed to be a last hurrah, a weekend carved out of time, before the world started making demands of them. They had grown up entangled in the way that only childhood allows. Summers spent barefoot along the same creek banks, winters crowded into their grandparents' farmhouse, playing cards and arguing over board games until someone got sent outside. They knew each other in the easy, thoughtless way that people only know those they've never had to introduce themselves to. The oldest was Josh, 19 years old and already carrying himself with the careful pride of someone preparing for something bigger. He'd spent that spring saving up for a used SUV and had just accepted a spot at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His younger brother Ryan was 17, the kind of quiet that gets mistaken for shyness, but was really just depth. He read constantly and said little unless what he had to say was worth saying. Their cousins Amy and Caleb filled out the group. Amy was 15, sharp and restless. Caleb was 18, the kind of steady presence that kept everyone else from spiraling. The plan had been simple, the way good plans always are before the world gets involved. 2 nights on the ridge, camping near the same ground where their grandfather had hunted deer back in the 60s and 70s. They'd talked about it for months, the way you talk about things when you know a chapter is closing. Before college, before jobs, before the slow drift that turns cousins into Christmas card acquaintances. Josh drove. Amy rode shotgun. Caleb and Ryan stretched out in the back with a cooler between them. On Friday afternoon, just before 6, they pulled into the only gas station along Route 19. A clerk behind the counter remembered them well. They bought firewood, several bottles of water, and a single disposable camera. The security footage confirmed it without question. 5:46 in the evening, the timestamp burned into the corner of the frame. They looked exactly like what they were, for young people at the beginning of something, laughing about whoever had forgotten the matches, elbowing each other near the candy rack. There was nothing in that footage that suggested it was the last time anyone outside their circle would see them alive. By Saturday night, the weather broke badly. The forecast had promised clear skies through the weekend, the kind of confident promise that meteorologists make about Tennessee summers and routinely have thrown back in their faces. Instead, a cold front slid unexpectedly over the hills, dropping the temperature by 15 degrees in under 2 hours and dragging fog with it so thick that the low roads vanished entirely. A farmer making his way home that night later told investigators he heard something strange echoing from the direction of the ridge. A metallic rhythmic sound like sheet metal rattling in a hard wind or a length of chain being dragged across gravel. He slowed down and listened for a moment before deciding it was the storm and moving on. When the cousins failed to appear by Sunday evening, their families moved from mild concern to something heavier almost immediately. These were not careless kids. They had supplies. They had experience. They had each other. By dark, phone calls were going unanswered. The only signal any of them sent came from Ryan's handset, a half-second of crackling static before the call dropped entirely. By Monday morning, both families were in their cars heading toward the trailhead off County Road 214, where Josh had said they'd parked. The SUV was right where it was supposed to be, sitting just past the gravel turnoff, locked, with the keys still in the ignition. Deputies from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office arrived within the hour. What they found inside the vehicle stopped them mid-routine and held them there. There were no signs of a struggle. The back seat had been folded flat to accommodate the camping gear, which was still there, sleeping bags rolled neatly, a cooler, a first aid kit tucked against the wheel well. But there were almost no fingerprints anywhere. Not on the door handles. Not on the interior panels. Not on the glass. The only prints recovered belonged to Josh, and only because he'd been the one driving. The windows had been wiped in long, streaky strokes that left a faint shine on the glass, but no trace of whoever made them. Following the impressions left in the soft earth by boots and tire treads, the search team made their way roughly half a mile into the forest and found the campsite. Or what should have been the campsite. It looked more like a stage set abandoned mid-construction. The tent had been unrolled, but never staked. Several cans of food sat in a plastic grocery bag, still sealed. The fire ring contained wood that had never been lit, just damp logs arranged loosely in a circle that had done nothing but absorb rain. And sitting alone on a flat rock nearby was a flip phone, its screen still faintly glowing, pushing out a low, steady hiss of static from the speaker into the silent trees. Deputies described a scene that felt curated rather than inhabited, as if someone had arranged the elements of a camping trip without having the slightest intention of actually camping. The search dogs were brought in and did what search dogs do, moving in wide arcs and following invisible paths through the trees. Each one lost the scent inside of 200 yards and circled back confused. No trail extended further than that in any direction. The scent simply ended, not faded, not redirected. Ended. Investigators held to the first and most charitable explanation. The cousins had gotten disoriented. Red Hollow was rugged terrain even for those who knew it. Steep ridgelines, ravines that appeared without warning, dense brush that could disorient even experienced hikers in good weather, let alone in fog, and dropping temperatures. Search teams spread out through the forest calling names, marking their paths with flagging tape, coordinating grid patterns while helicopters swept the canopy above with spotlights cutting through the gray air. By that evening, more than 30 volunteers had assembled, including family members who refused to leave. Amy's father waded the creek bed until there was no light left to see by, calling her name until his voice gave out. At the edge of the ridge, investigators discovered something small but difficult to dismiss. A folded piece of notebook, paper pressed into the mud at the base of a tree. Soaked through, most of the ink dissolved away. Only 2 words remained legible. South Path. No one could say with confidence who had written it, when it had been written, or what it meant. The paper was collected and sent to the lab. The rain had erased anything that might have told them more. The weather data added another layer of strangeness. The cold front that rolled through had dropped temperatures into the low 40s that Saturday night, which was exceptionally cold for late July even in the highlands. That explained the fog. That explained the miserable conditions. What it did not explain was why 4 reasonably prepared young people, equipped with gear and flashlights, had vanished without leaving a single footprint beyond the edge of their own campsite. The search expanded the following day to a 2-mile radius. Among the discoveries was a section of collapsed barbed wire fence leading toward an overgrown access path that didn't appear on any of the park's official trail maps. County records identified it as a remnant of a road that had once connected to an old logging operation shut down in the 1980s. It ran roughly in the direction that South Path suggested. Searchers followed it as far as they could before it disappeared into a rain-swollen gully, all slick red mud and broken branches jammed together in a pile. The volunteer base grew in those early days until it numbered in the hundreds, people arriving from 3 neighboring counties with their own maps, their own dogs, their own theories. The command post at the trailhead became a small city of folding tables and radios. Drones swept the canopy. State search and rescue teams brought cadaver dogs trained for exactly this kind of terrain. They covered more than 10 square miles and found nothing. Not a single discarded wrapper. Not a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. Not a dropped flashlight or a snapped sapling. It was as if the forest had simply accepted them and left no record of doing so. The local news named it the Red Hollow Mystery almost immediately, and once they did, the story began to take on a shape of its own. Reporters filmed the families at the trailhead, their faces wrecked with fear and exhaustion. They filmed the sheriff in front of microphones, steady but careful with his words. When one reporter asked whether foul play was suspected, the sheriff paused for a long beat before answering. "We are keeping all options open," he said. It was not the most reassuring answer, but it was the honest one. By the end of that week, a crime scene technician examining the interior of the SUV under ultraviolet light found trace evidence along the inside of the rear door. Faint streaks consistent with latex gloves, the kind worn by someone who needed to handle surfaces without leaving a trace. That detail did not get announced publicly right away, but it traveled fast within the department. It meant that someone had been inside that vehicle after it was parked and had taken deliberate care to ensure they left no evidence of it behind. The case shifted. The missing person report began to accommodate a darker explanation, possible abduction, or a disappearance that had been staged in some way. But the mechanics of it resisted any simple theory. No other tire tracks. No witnesses. No signs of confrontation. To intercept 4 people in a location that remote without leaving any physical trace behind would have required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary preparation. By the sixth night, as fog rolled back across the ridge, and searchers reported hearing those same faint metallic sounds again, rhythmic and sourceless in the dark, the sheriff told a reporter quietly, in a tone that was not meant for the cameras, that it felt like the woods had simply swallowed them whole. For the families standing at that trailhead in the gathering dark, staring at the treeline, it did not feel like a metaphor. The official search continued into the following week, expanding further, yielding less. And for every day that passed without answers, the weight of what they didn't know pressed down on those families harder than anything the summer heat could manage. Red Hollow, by the second week of searching, had transformed into something that looked more like a military staging area than a rescue effort. Cruisers lined the gravel road bumper to bumper. A command tent anchored the trailhead, its white canopy visible from a quarter-mile away. Volunteers in orange vests moved through the trees in slow, deliberate lines, while helicopters swept the hills above with thermal imaging equipment. At the center of it all stood Sheriff Carl Donnelly, a man who had spent his entire career in Monroe County and who had handled missing hikers before but had never faced four at once and never without a single piece of physical evidence pointing in any direction. Donnelly called in state resources on the second morning. Cadaver dogs, park rangers who knew the terrain well enough to move through it without a map, drones that could hold altitude in the morning wind and send back footage in real time. The search grid extended 3 miles outward from the SUV in every direction, covering the ridge and the creek beds and the shadowed hollows where the light never quite reached. What they found in all of that territory was silence. Searchers began to say that the forest felt different. Not in the way forests feel unfamiliar, but in a way that made experienced hunters and hikers stop and look over their shoulders without knowing why. Snapped branches weren't there. Fabric on thorns wasn't there. The trail that should have continued from a vehicle toward the ridge simply petered out and became unbroken undergrowth, as if the ground had healed itself overnight. Even the dogs were baffled. Each animal stopped at almost exactly the same point, 200 yards from a campsite, and returned to their handlers confused. By day, for the mood at the command post had changed. The early urgency had quieted into something harder and more exhausted. The heat was brutal by mid-morning, and the mud from the rain had dried into cracked red clay that caught at boots with every step. Deputies rotated in and out on 12-hour shifts, each rotation returning with nothing new to report. Searchers had begun calling the area the Hollow's Pull, half a joke about how the terrain seemed to resist progress in every direction. Inside the glove box of the SUV, tucked beneath the owner's manual, investigators found a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of an old logging survey from the early 1980s, faded and soft with age. Someone had marked it with pen, circling a section to the southeast of where the cousins had parked. A red X had been drawn over a location labeled Gully 3B. When deputies cross-referenced the marking against modern topographic maps, the spot aligned with a ravine well beyond the public trail system, accessible only through terrain that would have taken hours to reach on foot. Sheriff Donnelly sent 2 deputies to investigate. The hike took nearly 2 hours through brush so dense they had to cut their way through in places. What they found at the coordinates was an old machinery graveyard. Rusted logging equipment scattered across uneven ground, chains draped over collapsed metal frames, the remains of what might have been a tool shed collapsed into itself like a rotten tooth. The ground was pocked with small depressions from burrowing animals. Near one of them lay a scatter of bones that forensics later confirmed belonged to a white-tailed deer. What struck the deputies most was not what they found, but what they heard. Nothing. No insects. No birds. Just the slow, dry creak of trees moving in a wind they couldn't feel at ground level. They radioed back. Nothing here. Nothing human anyway. The families refused to leave the trailhead. Amy's father spent hours pacing the length of the gravel lot, watching the treeline with the particular intensity of a person waiting for something they know is not coming but cannot stop watching for anyway. Josh and Ryan's mother sat in a folding chair through the long hours of each afternoon, holding her son's old baseball cap in both hands, saying very little to anyone. When relatives tried to comfort her, she thanked them quietly and looked back toward the forest. By midweek, the investigation began to show strain from within. Rumors circulated among the volunteers that early evidence had been compromised, that the SUV had been accessed before the forensic team arrived, that the campsite had been walked through by too many boots before the documentation was complete. The sheriff denied it in a press statement, but the damage had already been done. Family members who had begun as grateful recipients of help were now asking pointed questions at the command post, demanding answers about why the search grid hadn't been extended sooner, why more resources hadn't arrived faster, why nobody had found so much as a footprint beyond 200 yards in any direction. The grief driving those questions was real and enormous, and it had nowhere else to go. A local pastor stood between a cousin's uncle and a deputy at one point when voices had risen past the threshold of a disagreement and were heading toward something worse. It was grief wearing the mask of anger, which is one of the things grief does when it has been sitting too long in the sun. When the press arrived in force, they brought satellite trucks and camera crews, and the particular appetite that missing person stories generate when the missing are young and photogenic, and the setting is sufficiently mysterious. Talk radio filled its hours with speculation. Some hosts suggested the kids had stumbled across an illegal operation in the woods, poachers, or something darker. Others blamed wildlife, citing the black bear population in that part of the county. A morning program brought in a local historian who mentioned the Red Hollow sinkholes, sections of ground that had been swallowing livestock and machinery for decades before the county fenced them off. That story spread immediately. Searchers began referring to a particular depression near the ridge as the pit. County engineers were dispatched with ground-penetrating radar, but the readings were inconclusive. The soil was too unstable, and the void too deep for the equipment to map clearly. On the seventh day, a cadaver dog alerted on a dry creek bed about a mile from the campsite. The energy at the command post surged. The area was cordoned off and excavated over 2 full days. What the team found was a shallow depression full of rainwater and animal tracks and nothing else. It was the first of several false alarms that would come to define the later stage of the search, each one producing the same temporary rush of hope, followed by the same long drop back into nothing. The search perimeter eventually stretched to 15 square miles. By day 10, the official effort was being scaled back. Most of the volunteers had returned to their lives, to their jobs and their families, because the world does not pause for grief. A handful of officers remained on rotation, walking paths they had already walked, checking coordinates they had already checked. The families protested outside the county courthouse, holding signs and demanding that the department not abandon their children. The sheriff met with them. He said everything a person in his position could say and offered nothing that actually helped, because there was nothing that actually helped. The press moved on. The satellite trucks disappeared. The story slipped from the front page, and then from the second page, and then from the news entirely. And Red Hollow returned to being what it had always been, a stretch of dense Tennessee forest that did not much care whether anyone understood it. For the families, the years that followed were the kind that accumulate without becoming easier. Small things, a smell in autumn, a song a July evening going from warm to cool, could pull them back to that weekend with a precision that was almost physical. The case file sat in the basement of the sheriff's office in weathered folders that smelled of old paper and moisture. And the forest sat on the ridge, exactly as it always had, keeping whatever it knew. By 2025, Red Hollow had been quiet for more than 2 decades. The county road leading toward the ridge had been half reclaimed by the vegetation pressing in from both sides. The wooden sign that once marked the trailhead still stood, but barely, leaning at an angle that suggested it had given up trying. The paint had flaked away, and the lettering was almost gone. Most people drove past without noticing it. Hunters used parts of the hollow. The occasional hiker with an interest in old logging history came through once in a while. But mostly the place just existed at the edge of the county's memory, the way certain stories do, never quite forgotten because they never quite resolved. Sheriff Carl Donnelly had retired nearly a decade earlier. He was in his 70s now, slower in his movements, gray in a way that made him look like he had earned every shade of it. But each July, on the weekend nearest the anniversary of the disappearance, he drove out to the old trailhead alone. He would park his truck near the gravel turnoff and stand for a while beside the weathered wooden cross someone had hammered into the ground there years ago. He stayed until the lights started going, and then he drove home. The new sheriff had asked him once what he went out there for. Donnelly thought about it for a moment before answering. Because somebody has to, he said. 2 of the parents had died without their questions being answered. Amy's mother passed in 2016 after years of illness that her family said had started the summer her daughter disappeared. Josh and Ryan's father died 2 years after that from his heart. The surviving relatives still gathered from time to time, sitting around kitchen tables with old photograph albums open between them, saying the same things they had always said to each other. What did we miss? Where did they go? Why can't we find them? Around the 20-year mark, a true crime podcast called Vanished in Plain Air released a 3-part series on the case. The hosts had done serious research, pulling old records and speaking with retired deputies, and even getting Sheriff Donnelly on the phone for nearly 2 hours. The series covered everything that had been made public: the static from a phone at the campsite, the wiped fingerprints in the SUV, the note in the mud with just those 2 words. Within weeks of the first episode dropping, the listenership exploded. The story traveled through true crime communities the way certain stories do when they have the right combination of elements: young victims, beautiful and isolated setting, and a complete absence of resolution. YouTube channels began producing long-form analysis videos. Forums filled with threads cataloging every detail of the original investigation and speculating freely about the ones that hadn't been released. An amateur radio operator posted a thread claiming that his signal logs from 2003 showed unusual interference patterns near Red Hollow during the exact weekend of the disappearance. He described the interference as following a pulse sequence unlike natural atmospheric noise, closer to a distress signal without an identifiable source. The thread attracted thousands of responses. Law enforcement later said the logs had never been formally verified. As the online interest grew, so did the theories. One popular line of thinking held that the cousins had discovered the entrance to an unmapped mine shaft somewhere on the ridge. Another pointed toward illegal activity in the woods, someone who needed that section of forest kept empty and quiet. The more sensational theories went further into territory that the families found painful and the investigators found useless. But buried inside all of that noise, the renewed attention had one meaningful consequence. It reached the right person. In early 2024, a detective from a Monroe County cold case unit named Laura Hensley quietly requested the files. She was young enough that the original disappearance had happened when she was still a child, but she had grown up in the county and had heard the story the way everyone there heard it, in pieces, at the edges of conversations, as a kind of local legend with a real wound at its center. When she read through the original case material for the first time, she kept thinking the same thing. It feels unfinished. She reached out to the surviving family members that spring, gently, asking if they would be willing to submit updated DNA samples to be compared against unidentified remains held in the state database. It wasn't a promise. She was careful to say that. It was just a door she wanted to open and see what was on the other side. The families agreed immediately. After 22 years, even the smallest action felt like a form of breath. Meanwhile, the county had approved a new logging contract covering sections of Red Hollow Forest that hadn't been worked since the early 2000s. Environmental groups filed objections based on erosion risk, and the local opposition was vocal, but the contract moved forward and survey crews began marking trees and cutting access roads along the lower ridge, working their way toward the area near the old campsite. Longtime residents were unhappy about it. They said that ground should be left alone. Some of the older ones spoke in terms that the county dismissed as superstition: lights visible between trees after dark, a low mechanical hum that seemed to come from underground, compass needles behaving strangely near the gully. Equipment failures among the logging crews were reported from the first week: radios losing power mid-transmission, a foreman whose crew refused to work past sunset 3 nights in a row. The same week the machines moved in, Detective Hensley received a phone call. A man who said he had been a volunteer during the original search came forward with something he hadn't thought to mention at the time, or hadn't known how to mention. He wasn't entirely sure which. He said that on the last night of the official search, he'd been standing near the Ridge Road when 2 deputies' radios both cut out at the same moment, replaced by the same low static that had been coming from a phone at the campsite. He said one of the deputies, a younger man whose name he couldn't fully recall, had gone very still listening to it. And then, just before it cleared, the deputy had said quietly that he thought he could hear something underneath the noise. A voice or something like one. The word repeated but too faint and too distorted to make out clearly. The witness said the deputy looked uncomfortable for the rest of that evening and didn't talk much about it afterward. Detective Hensley logged the statement and didn't share it publicly. But she thought about it for a long time. That summer, she drove out to Red Hollow herself, parking at the overgrown trailhead and standing for a while with the original case file under her arm and the treeline in front of her. The road behind her was nearly impassable. The forest ahead looked exactly like a forest that had had 22 years to grow however it wanted. In town, people noticed her visits. Some said it was good to see someone finally doing something. Others said the best thing for everyone would be to leave the case exactly where time had left it. But by then, the logging crews were already on the ridge, and the old podcast episodes were still collecting new listeners every week, and the families were waiting for DNA results from labs that moved in their own time. Red Hollow was no longer sleeping quietly. Something had begun to stir in it, and on the 22nd anniversary, as the surviving relatives stood together near the treeline in the late afternoon, someone in the group mentioned hearing a low hum, barely there, like a generator buried far underground. Most of them dismissed it. But Detective Hensley, watching from a distance, filed it somewhere in the back of her mind and did not quite let it go. It was early September and just past first light when Mark Ellison pulled his truck off the old service road and stepped out into the cool air of Red Hollow with his bow and his pack. He was a lifelong hunter, knew this forest the way some people know their own houses, not perfectly but intimately, in the way that comes from years of quiet attention. He had a spot in mind along the ridge where the deer trails converge near an old fallen oak, and he moved toward it through the trees with the practiced silence of someone used to not disturbing things. He found the stones by accident. He almost walked past them entirely, and he would have, except that his eye caught something wrong in the texture of the ground without his brain immediately knowing what. He stopped and looked. The forest floor around him was the usual layering of damp leaves and exposed roots and soft red soil. But in one shallow area, the earth was covered by small flat rocks laid close together, too regular and too deliberate to be anything but intentional. He crouched down. The stones had been placed in a rough rectangle, concealing a patch of ground about the size of a doorway. He pushed a few of them aside with his gloved hand. Beneath the surface, pressed into the dirt, he found the edge of something that looked like the sole of a boot. Hard and cracked, half dissolved with age, but still connected to a sliver of decayed fabric. He moved more stones. And then, just inches from the boot fragment, pale gray-white against the dark soil, lay something small and curved. He had seen enough deer bones over the years to know immediately that what he was looking at was not one. He stood up. He stood there for a while doing nothing, which is what people do when their mind is running hard to catch up with what their eyes have already processed. Then he took out his phone, looked at it, and dialed the sheriff's office. His voice was not quite steady when dispatch answered. He said, "I think I found something up on Red Hollow Ridge." Deputies arrived within the hour. The area was sealed with tape. Mark was asked to stay nearby and was interviewed at the edge of the perimeter while investigators suited up and moved carefully into the site. By late afternoon, the ridge had transformed into a quiet, methodical crime scene, forensic technicians moving in measured steps, placing number markers beside each discovery before anyone touched anything, photographing every angle of every detail before the first layer of stones came off. What lay beneath those stones was a shallow depression about 5 feet long and 2 feet wide. Too small to be a grave dug with care and time, but deep enough and shaped enough to make the intention behind it impossible to misread. As the excavation proceeded, fragments of bone emerged, small clusters scattered at irregular intervals, pieces of weathered cloth still attached to some of them, barely holding together. Beside one cluster lay a rusted metal flask. On its surface, faint but legible beneath the corrosion, were 2 letters. J and R. The forensic team's pace changed. The letters matched the initials of Joshua Raburn, the oldest of the 4 cousins. The mood on that ridge shifted in the way that it shifts when a thing that has been hoped against suddenly becomes impossible to deny. The excavation extended into the following day. Portable lighting was erected around the perimeter and a tent raised over the site to protect it from weather. Working slowly through the soil, technicians found additional remains, fragments of a second skull, sections of rib, a piece of melted plastic fused to the earth. When the coroner examined what had been recovered, the physical evidence spoke with a clarity that the forest itself had refused to offer for 2 decades. The bones showed signs of blunt force trauma, fractures consistent with a hard impact from falling debris or a direct strike. There were no marks from animal activity, no signs of post-mortem disturbance by wildlife. Whatever had happened in this place had been violent in origin and deliberate in its concealment. Within 72 hours, dental records confirmed what everyone working the site had already begun to accept. The remains belonged to Josh Raburn and his cousin Caleb Thomas. The announcement hit the community the way that long-delayed news hits, with relief and devastation arriving at the same moment, each one making the other harder to hold. Detective Laura Hensley drove to the site and walked the perimeter alone before she did anything else. She was trying to understand the geography, the relationship between this location and everything else she knew about the case. What she was standing on was nearly 2 miles from where the original search had focused. The terrain between the campsite and this spot was steep and overgrown, and difficult enough to navigate in daylight with a map. In fog and rain at night, it was a different world entirely. Searchers 22 years ago had set their grid over the most logical area and had never reached this. She wasn't sure she would have done anything differently. The site inventory built quickly. Fragments of nylon fiber matching camping gear. A corroded lighter. Pieces of melted plastic identified as components from a Coleman portable stove, the same model widely available in outdoor retail stores in the summer of 2003. The discovery of those stove pieces was significant in a way that cut in 2 directions. It meant either that the cousins had camped here voluntarily in a location far from where they were expected to be, or that their equipment had been moved here long after they vanished. The flask was examined first at the lab. Despite more than 20 years of exposure, the interior still held trace material. Residual alcohol mixed with soil sediment. The flask had been struck hard on one side, the metal bent inward sharply by a single impact. Hensley looked at that dent for a long time. The depression itself troubled her most when she thought about it carefully. It lacked the characteristics of an intentional burial. The depth was wrong. The distribution of the remains was scattered rather than organized. The stone covering had been applied quickly, she thought, by someone under pressure rather than someone with time to spare. It looked less like a burial and more like a problem being buried, which was not the same thing at all. Cross-referencing the GPS data from Mark Ellison's hunting device with old forestry and survey maps, analysts made a connection that stopped the room when it was presented. The precise location of the site aligned almost perfectly with the spot marked on the old map found in the cousins' SUV in 2003, the location labeled Gully 3B and marked with a red X. Someone in that group had known where they were going, or had been directed there. And the ground-penetrating radar that moved in after the initial excavation found something else. Anomalies extending several yards beyond the first site. Irregular voids in the soil. Density shifts consistent with buried metal or organic material. The excavation expanded. From the extended area came a series of additional finds. A corroded camping stove frame, still structurally intact despite its condition. A section of weathered tarp fused to the surrounding soil. Small bones, initially catalogued as possibly animal, later confirmed as human phalanges. And from a deeper layer, 2 personal items. A metal keychain shaped like a compass, its needles still barely visible beneath the rust. And the face plate of a wristwatch, its crystal shattered, the hands frozen at 10:47. By the end of the first week of excavation, when the forensic team packed up their equipment each night and generators hummed in the dark and the forest pressed in around the perimeter, even the most experienced investigators on site described a quality to the atmosphere they struggled to articulate. Not fear exactly. More like the sense of being in a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had not yet decided to release it. The county coroner's preliminary findings were stark in their precision. Both victims had suffered blunt force trauma consistent with a single directional impact. The nature of the fractures was not consistent with a fall or with the collapse of terrain. Fire had occurred near or over the burial site at some point, evidenced by chemically distinct charred debris in the surrounding soil. The burned material was consistent with nylon tent fabric. The coroner's report concluded its initial section with a phrase that was clinical in its language and devastating in its implication. The manner of death was not accidental. Red Hollow was no longer a cold case. It was an active homicide investigation, and the ridge that had swallowed 4 young people in the summer of 2003 was finally beginning to give them back. In the weeks after the initial recovery, the excavation at Red Hollow took on a different character. The forensic grid had expanded another 30 yards down the slope, guided by radar readings that had flagged additional subsurface voids. What had begun as a targeted exhumation was now something closer to an archaeological operation, with teams sifting soil layer by layer, cataloging each object before removing it, rebuilding a picture of what had happened here from the ground up. On the 14th day of the expanded dig, something emerged from the hillside that no one had anticipated finding. As the excavation moved deeper into the slope, the top edge of a metal frame became visible in the dirt. The team's initial assumption was that it was another piece of old logging equipment which the area had been littered with. But as the shape clarified, it became apparent this was not a machine. It was a vehicle buried nose first into the hillside at a steep angle, its rear axle protruding from the slope like a broken limb. The metal was heavily corroded and the paint long gone, but lettering remained on one of the doors, faint but decipherable. Monroe County Maintenance. County records located the match. A 1978 Chevrolet utility truck reported missing in 1989 following a storm that had caused significant erosion and minor collapses along several parts of the ridge. The official conclusion at the time had been that the truck had slid into a ravine and been washed away. No search had found it, and eventually it had been written off the inventory and forgotten. A crane was brought in to stabilize the slope and prevent collapse as excavation around the cab proceeded. The windows were shattered, the interior packed with compacted sediment, and a smell like burned plastic mixed with decades of rust. As that compacted material was carefully removed, 3 objects emerged from between the collapsed seat frames that stopped the forensic team entirely. 3 mobile phones, their casings melted and fused together into a single blackened mass. And beside them, the remains of a handheld radio, smashed but still bearing a partial identification tag. Property of Monroe County. The fused phones made no sense in that truck. Cell phones from 2003 could not have been inside a vehicle that had been lost underground since 1989. But when technicians cleaned and scanned the mass, running it through imaging equipment designed to read surfaces obscured by damage, faint serial numbers emerged beneath the residue. Those numbers were cross-referenced against carrier records and confirmed against the missing persons file. They belonged to 3 of the 4 cousins. Amy's flip phone, Ryan's Nokia, Caleb's prepaid handset. All 3 had been listed as unrecoverable since the weekend in late July 2003. The coroner's office, working in parallel, had continued its analysis of the skeletal remains. Both sets confirmed from the initial recovery showed blunt force trauma consistent with impact from falling debris or heavy metal. But bone marrow samples returned a finding that reshaped the entire investigation. Both victims had elevated carbon monoxide levels preserved in the marrow, indicating significant exposure to the gas prior to death. They had not died instantly from impact. They had been breathing poisoned air. Detective Hensley took that information and began working backward through what was now known about the site. A buried maintenance truck with a damaged exhaust system. An underground structure with compromised ventilation. The remnants of camping equipment suggesting the cousins had been inside some kind of enclosed space when things went wrong. A severe storm on a Saturday night in late July with rapidly dropping temperatures and dense fog. For young people looking for shelter. A theory formed. The cousins had found the truck or found an opening into the underground space while exploring the ridge in deteriorating weather. They had brought their stove inside for warmth and light, not understanding the ventilation conditions of the space they were in. The carbon monoxide had built quickly in the enclosed environment. They would have felt it the way people feel carbon monoxide in the early stages, as a heaviness, a confusion, a desire to sleep before understanding what was happening to them, if they ever did. On paper, that was an accident. A terrible, coherent accident. But the evidence refused to stay within those boundaries. Soil compression analysis of the surrounding layers showed not 1 period of disturbance, but 2. The first matched natural erosion patterns consistent with the site's exposure to rain and freeze-thaw cycles over many years. The second indicated deliberate manual disturbance, estimated to have occurred roughly 2 to 3 years after the cousins' disappearance. Someone had come back. A piece of fabric recovered from beneath the driver's seat of the buried truck complicated matters further. It was a section of uniform sleeve, torn at the elbow, the fabric consistent with workwear manufactured in the 1990s. The tag was still legible enough to show the Monroe County seal. DNA extracted from a fabric confirmed it belonged to a male adult with no match among the victims. When county employee records were checked against the sample, no match was found in any active or archived personnel file. Whoever had worn that sleeve, they had no formal record with the department. The forensic reconstruction continued to expand and contract like something breathing. It provided coherent explanations and then undermined them with the next artifact. The melted plastic insulation scattered near the buried vehicle's chassis. Ethanol and lubricant residue indicating combustion. Soil chemistry matching the camping fuel used in the Coleman stove. A fire had burned near this location, confined and low, insufficient to break the surface, but thorough enough to leave its chemical signature in the earth. Analysts theorized a sequence. The cousins enter the enclosed space. They light the stove. The carbon monoxide builds faster than they can recognize the danger. A later collapse, possibly triggered by heavy rainfall in the days following their disappearance, shifts the buried truck and creates the conditions that mix the evidence, pulling equipment and phones into the vehicle's interior as the structure settles. Years of erosion do the rest. But one detail refused to fit. One of the skulls recovered had sediment embedded not merely on its exterior, but within the cranial cavity itself. That only happens when a skull is exposed, not sealed in place. It had been opened to the elements at some point after death, and then covered again. It had been disturbed and then reburied. That was not erosion. That was not structural collapse. That was someone with hands. County records from 2005 showed an erosion control project conducted in the general area. A contractor had been hired for short-term work on the ridge. The work order was partially illegible, water damaged and incomplete, the name of the contractor clear enough in some places and gone entirely in others. Investigators believed someone connected to that project had found the site and had buried it again instead of calling anyone. The 3 phones retrieved from the fused mass presented one more detail before the forensic team was finished with them. 2 were damaged beyond data recovery. The third, the Nokia registered to Ryan, had interior memory sectors that had survived their enclosure in an oxygen-poor environment. Data recovery software extracted partial file structures, corrupted timestamps, incomplete logs, and a single brief audio fragment, 6 seconds long. The recording was mostly static. But in the final 2 seconds, beneath the interference, there was something. Audible breathing, labored and close to the microphone. And then, just before the file ended, a sound that might have been a word. Analysts who reviewed it independently reached 2 different conclusions. Some heard help. Others heard stop. The recording was too degraded to determine which, or whether it was either. When the results were shared with the families, the careful distance that grief had built over 22 years collapsed entirely. For all the years they had held on to the idea that maybe the cousins had been lost, maybe confused, maybe somewhere unknown, but perhaps not suffering, the audio fragment replaced that possibility with something far more specific. Someone had been alive in that space long enough to reach for a phone and leave a record of being there. Detective Hensley visited the ridge that evening after the crew had gone, crouching at the edge of the excavation site with the day's findings still running through her mind. The site had been covered for safety, but the earth around it was dark and raw-looking in the way of ground recently disturbed. The air smelled of clay and old moisture, and the particular mineral sharpness of soil turned up from depth. She thought about the geography again. If the cousins had truly wandered here seeking shelter from a storm, they would have been moving away from a main trail and into terrain that was actively difficult to navigate in good conditions. To reach this spot in fog and dropping temperatures and rain would have required either accident or direction. And if it was accident, how had they known to follow a path that wasn't on any public map? When she ordered a re-examination of Mark Ellison's GPS track the next morning and had it overlaid against old forestry survey maps, the analyst pointed to something that had been invisible in the modern data. The hunter's route followed the faint outline of an old access road that had been removed from county maps sometime in the late 1990s. That road had connected to the maintenance zone. It had led directly to the area last formally serviced in 1989, the same year the buried truck disappeared. The road had been erased from the official record, but the ground still remembered it in the compression of the soil, in the slight clearing of the vegetation, in the way the trees on either side leaned very slightly inward, as if filling a gap that had once been kept open. Wherever the cousins had been going that night, someone or something had pointed them toward a road that no longer officially existed, leading to a place the county had chosen not to talk about. As the forensic teams prepared to continue work on the newly identified subsurface anomalies detected below the current excavation, one of the radar operators paused mid-scan and called for the others to come look at his screen. There was a shadow forming in the data beneath the current excavation zone, larger than the truck, more regular than a natural void, almost rectangular, not metal, not organic in the way soil is organic. Whatever it was, it had been there longer than any of them. By early spring of 2026, the State Forensic Lab had finished its analysis of everything recovered from Red Hollow. The DNA sequencing was complete. The additional trace remains recovered from the deeper layers of the excavation matched Amy and Ryan, the 2 cousins whose recoveries had until then remained incomplete. For the first time in 23 years, every name could be placed. Every person could be accounted for. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. And yet the question that drove people hardest was not identity. It was sequence. How had 4 young people familiar with these woods, properly equipped, in a group, vanished within 5 miles of a main road, and remained hidden for more than 2 decades. The forensic reconstruction assembled from all of the available data told a story that was equal parts tragic and strange. The slope where the cousins had camped sat directly above a section of old underground infrastructure, a decommissioned storm drainage system built in the 1970s for the county road department. Over the following decades, heavy rain and the freeze-thaw cycles of Tennessee winters had caused portions of that system to collapse, leaving hollow voids beneath the ridge, spaces large enough in some places for a person to stand. Soil analysis combined with three-dimensional mapping of the excavated area confirmed what had previously only been suspected. In 2003, a narrow entrance to one of those underground chambers would have been visible at the surface, an opening between exposed rock and a tangle of tree roots, a gap just large enough for someone to squeeze through. It had since been sealed by sediment, but the old disposable camera recovered from the site had yielded one more piece of evidence. One of the last frames on the roll, grainy and slightly overexposed, showed what appeared to be the inside of a narrow passage, rusted metal beams visible in the upper corners, darkness beyond. A space no one outside the cousins had known they had found. Engineers reconstructed what had likely happened inside. The group had brought their Coleman stove into the chamber for warmth and light, which was a reasonable decision in deteriorating weather given that they had no way to understand the ventilation conditions of the space they'd entered. The underground structure connected at one point to the buried maintenance truck's exhaust pathway. That connection had corroded but not fully closed. In certain conditions, the gas from the stove and the residual gases from the vehicle's deteriorating components could have combined to create a carbon monoxide concentration that would overcome for people quickly and without the kind of warning that allows a person to understand what's happening to them. The coroner's final report confirmed that all 4 cousins showed bone marrow carbon monoxide levels consistent with rapid incapacitation in an enclosed space. The blunt force trauma on 2 of the skulls was consistent with a later structural collapse as the unstable tunnel shifted, probably in the heavy rains that followed the weekend of their disappearance. The stove, the phones, the lighter, the watch, the flask, all of it pulled into the buried truck's cab as the earth above settled over the course of days and weeks and seasons. For most of the investigators who had worked the case, that was the answer. An accident. A cascade of misfortune beginning with a storm and ending with a structural failure that no one could have anticipated. It explained almost every piece of evidence in a way that cohered. Almost every piece. In the final phase of excavation, forensic surveyors working the clay soil at the edge of the collapse zone found a set of footprints. They were faint, preserved by the low oxygen environment in the sediment layers, but unmistakably present and unmistakably human. The tread pattern was that of a work boot manufactured in the 1990s. The prints did not belong to any of the victims. They led away from the site along a shallow incline and then stopped at the edge of the slope, as if whoever left them had simply walked to the margin of that ground and stepped off it. Forensic dating placed the compression of those prints at roughly 20 years prior, which aligned with the period around 2005, the same window identified previously as the time of the second disturbance. Someone had been here after the tunnel collapsed, after the cousins died, after the earth began to settle over them. And that person had walked away without making a single call or filing a single report. Detective Hensley returned to the county employment records from that period looking for any name associated with work near the ridge. The maintenance logs from 2005 were damaged and incomplete, but one name appeared on more than one document. A seasonal contractor named Roy Dalton, hired for flood repair work for a period of several months before leaving without notice, without settling his accounts at the local trailer park where he'd been renting, without providing any forwarding address. He had sold a truck for cash near the end of his time in the county, and then simply was not there anymore. Locals who remembered him described a quiet man who kept himself separate from others. One shop owner recalled him coming into town once with deep scratches along his forearms and soil ground into the creases of his knuckles, saying something about a bad cave, and then buying supplies and leaving without elaborating. Roy Dalton was himself a missing person, reported years later by a relative who had lost contact with him. No remains were ever found. No explanation ever surfaced for where he went. Whether Dalton had stumbled onto the site accidentally while working the ridge or had some prior connection to the location that had never been documented, investigators could not determine. But the convergence of the evidence pointed in one direction. Someone had found the cousins years after they died, understood what they were looking at, and covered it again. Whether from guilt or fear or something else entirely, they had made a choice not to bring those four young people home. When the findings were made public, the response divided sharply between those who felt that 23 years of not knowing had finally given way to something resembling closure, and those who found the details of the discovery more haunting than the mystery had been. For the families, it was neither simple nor singular. The grief they had carried had been built around absence, and now the absence had been replaced by specifics that were much harder to hold. That spring, the surviving relatives gathered on the ridge without cameras or reporters. They were there to mark a site with something more permanent than uncertainty. 4 wooden crosses, each carved by hand with a name and a year. They stood in a line along the slope facing outward toward the forest, and the people who had put them there stood quietly in front of them for a long while, doing what people do in places like that when there are no words adequate to the occasion, and silence is the most honest option. Detective Hensley stood with them, slightly to one side, watching the light move through the canopy above. The excavation site had been filled and sealed and was already showing the early signs of vegetation returning, thin grass pressing through the disturbed earth in a way that growth always does eventually, indifferent to the history beneath it. She had filed her final report 3 days earlier. It was thorough and carefully worded, and contained everything that the evidence had confirmed and nothing it hadn't. In the conclusion, she had quoted something that Carl Donnelly had said years ago at one of the anniversary gatherings, standing at the ridge as fog moved in behind him. A reporter had asked whether he believed the case would be solved. He had been quiet for a while before answering. "We will find the truth," he had said, "but not the whole of it." Standing at the edge of the cleared site with the spring wind in the trees and 4 crosses throwing thin shadows across the slope, Hensley thought that he had been right in a way that he probably hadn't intended. The science was complete. The records were in order. The case was formally closed. But those boot prints leaving the site at the edge of the slope, preserved in clay for 20 years, still asked a question that no report could answer fully. What had the person who made them seen in those moments before they turned and walked away? And what had it cost them to keep walking? For everyone who had ever stood at this ridge and looked into the trees, that question would stay. Not loudly, not insistently, but with the particular persistence of things that have been buried and come back up again, quieter than before and somehow heavier for it. Red Hollow had given up what it could. What it kept, it would keep in the way that certain places keep certain things, present in the ground beneath your feet, felt but not seen, carried by everyone who walks away from it, and never quite set down.